And try and get people a little bit level set. It was encouraging to see the poll earlier that so many of your organizations have already kind of gone down a data analytics track and started working on a kind of presumably some form of integrated data platform. For those of you who have not gone down that path or for looking for more understanding of how other organizations are kind of setting that up, hopefully this will be helpful to kind of get everybody up to speed. So I'm going to be talking about kind of two sections to this presentation. The first of which we'll be going through kind of the traditional utility approach to software development and kind of integrating new systems, and then a little bit on where we're at right now and how we're developing kind of as an industry, with a few insights from kind of what we'd call tier 2, tier 3 utilities from a size perspective. Tier 2 meaning about 100,000 to 1 million customers. Tier 3 meaning under 100,000 customers. But this will be largely focused on the larger utilities. So looking at the traditional utility approach, there's a lot of key things to kind of realize. We approach IT projects kind of like we approach substations. We plan them in advance. We take sometimes multiple years looking at a particular technology before we even pull up a requirements document. And we're looking for 5, 10 years of use out of that particular large software investment. We're looking at what features we want 10 years from now, 5 years from now, because it's most likely going to be 10 to 15 years before we replace those systems. Very different from what you'd find, for instance, on our GTM marketing side, where every other week there's a new application being added to understand our customers better. We focus on buying and then customizing, so we go through this very arduous process, very deep requirements. We end up using, for several years, only a fraction of what those requirements actually go through. And we often end up having to do a lot of customization because we have multiple, obviously multiple legacy systems that have to be connected in to be able to get the data to build those requirements out, as well as, in some cases, customize just to get that feature out of that system, because it may not be something that comes standard. And then the collection and cleaning efforts. I heard a stat that was particularly interesting from a consultancy that was focused purely on digitalization, so looking broadly outside of the utility industry. And they kind of mentioned a percentage of time associated with creating new capabilities within a software context. A lot of folks, and what I've experienced in a lot of cases, is 75, 80% of the time is just cleaning and organizing our data. But when you look at people that are leading in those areas, it's 20 to 30%. Now, don't expect this industry to get to that level anytime soon. It does take years to build your data structures in that way. But that's the end goal we're trying to get to, where we're not constantly held back by the inability to get data from across our organization. From a data collection and cleaning effort perspective, I think it's pretty indicative to think about some of the ADMS efforts we've gone through over the past decade. There were projects that took more than 3 years just to clean the GIS system enough to have a working impedance model and a working connectivity model to run those DMS platforms. So some of those projects were 5-year projects, and it wasn't necessarily because the software itself wasn't something that worked. It's because we weren't prepared to allow that system to work. And there's a whole lot of, I can talk for hours on those topics. We won't go into every detail on that. But on the last point, we develop processes that are necessary to support individual projects, individual models that support those projects. In a lot of cases, that data may be redundant with several other models. We have transmission planning models, transmission operating models, distribution planning models, distribution operating models. We have models for protection in some cases that are different from the models for planning. All these systems are updated in some respect when there's major changes to the grid. So we may end up having 3, 4 times where we're changing something. So why is this difficult? Well, in the past, that may not be as big of a problem, but we are adding a lot more devices to our system. We are getting a lot more data. This is no surprise to anybody. There's tens of thousands of devices on the distribution automation side that have gone out since 2010. There, as of 2017, almost 80 million AMI meters in the US. I think our numbers is we're expecting around 741 million globally if you count some of the kind of lower tech meters that you'd see in certain Asian countries by the end of this year. So we're collecting a lot of data that's actually internal to the utility in most cases around the world. And we're adding these systems, these data points at a fast clip. It's not too big of a problem because at least it's internal. We can control the solution from top to bottom. But when you look at just residential DERs in the US, and a lot of this is thermostats, to be clear. I think it's around 27 million, we think, by the end of this year is thermostats. We're talking about 30 million points that have likely some type of connection. There are going to be some solar plants that don't have any connection, but cellular, Wi-Fi, somebody's collecting that data either for a billing purpose with their customer or just to understand the operations and maintenance side of that asset. So that data is something we can't necessarily get at easily. We are developing partnerships. There are a lot of software vendors that are working to try and bring some of those capabilities internal. But it's not something that fits into our legacy systems well. And it doesn't fit into a 10-year plan well either, because those thermostats started going out from the ones we're talking about, which are two-way internet-connected ones, in the last decade. So if you bought your DRMS 10 years ago, you're missing out on a tremendous number of assets that have cropped up quickly. And you may have to design a custom piece to add into that or switch platforms. So what we've often done is, and this is the way we kind of cover this market, and it's not a perfect view. It's very hard to nail down the number of use cases that a utility has. I think even internally, it can be hard to look towards analytics use cases because, as we had earlier, Excel can be considered analytics at a certain point. But we look at this largely from an application point of view. The majority of these projects are ones that involve some type of vendor that is providing a kind of standardized solution. But from 2010 to today, just looking at that range in time, there's 1,150 projects, 1,150 deployments that we've identified across these analytics areas. And we have, I think, 13 total. I grouped some of them just to make it a little bit easier to see. So what we've done often is add in these kind of bolt-on pieces to kind of fill in gaps. Certain areas different than others. Energy efficiency engagement largely is a bolt-on versus volt-var control or switching, maybe something attached to a DMS or not. It could be attached to the SCADA, et cetera. So vast differences in how we do it, but how we've usually dealt with these problems is by adding in these additional applications, which adds more complexity to the system. So I want to talk a little bit about where we're going. And every utility is different in this process. I think we had around 40% in the poll of folks that are kind of up and running in this respect. But we know that we want to attract more digital talent. That has been synonymous with data scientists. It's not the best to only think of data scientists as digital talent. They can't operate on their own generally, or not as efficiently as they could with other additional help. But digital talent has a different view than what we see from a utility perspective. They're often architecting databases, often for younger companies too that aren't dealing with legacy systems, but architecting databases to maintain the data assets from a common pool of information and then build out applications or connect in applications as time goes on, as the needs present themselves. Allows for a much faster process of commissioning software and adding capabilities. They work on faster timelines. You're not doing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year roadmaps. We're really used to and very good at doing 5- and 10-year roadmaps for all kinds of capital planning, including IT. It's different when you start talking about use cases because we have to think about what changes occur in our particular area, at our particular utility. And those prioritizations may change as frequently as monthly or quarterly. So it's something you have to review and understand if there is something that should be moved up the queue, for instance. Buying and selling tools mentioned earlier might be something that instead of buying once every 4 years and having your monolithic database, you may have one every 1.5 years because you have a use case that needs to bring in stream processing for some reason. That might not be something you initially integrated. There might be a different bolt-on, open source, or from a vendor that you want to put on to be able to integrate into that data platform. So you're looking at a more frequent churn in what your actual stack is. And then finally, this is something I just kind of add because I think it's important to realize from a leadership perspective to get something like this working in a utility, and I'll even say within my own organization, it is hard to get people to buy in 2 or 3 weeks when you have a request of them. So you need some level of executive support to help clear barriers, to help negotiate between organizations and be able to be that liaison to make sure that when you're on a project that these folks aren't sitting around for 3 months waiting for buy-in to get data from a particular area, that they're able to get a confirmation from the legal department that they're complying with privacy rules and be able to pull some information. So when we look at digitalization, I like to think of it less about a physical capability and less about saying, hey, we took this process and now it's digital and everything's connected, and more about an institutional competency. And makes it hard to talk about it from a market research perspective in a lot of ways, because you're not necessarily pointing to technology always. But it's really what we've seen from a utility industry perspective is this process that they kind of are starting to put in place or have put in place that is cyclical, but starts with hiring a core team, getting the human resources in place that you need, some of those digital assets, some of your internal assets for that matter, being able to prioritize and create use cases. Surprisingly, from most any utility I've talked to, they never have trouble coming up with use cases. I read somewhere, I think I hadn't actually talked to this utility, but one utility executive sent around just a note to a bunch of his SMEs. Give me 3 use cases. Within 2 weeks, they had over 100. Everybody has things they want to solve, things they wanted to do for years. The question is, how do you gather that all up and make sense of how to prioritize that from a value perspective? Once you've selected that use case, making sure you're able to figure out what technology you actually need. That may include changing your data platform, adding pieces to it. It may include simply going out to a vendor and getting an algorithm or getting an application that is able to pull information from that central place. But getting the necessary tools to make that data platform work for that use case. And then, obviously when you start building that application, it's extremely important to get end user understandings of how they actually do whatever process you're trying to automate or what algorithms they use today. Because I think one of the most interesting things in my 8 years at GTM Research and now WoodMac that I ran into is I did a lot of work at one point on generation analytics. And it was fascinating to see people invest in a bunch of monitoring, get some algorithms, and no one in the field wanted to use it. So they spent millions of dollars on transmission transformer monitoring, and the benefit actually turned into the main asset manager for the transmission system saying they clearly, the monitoring system probably caused the failure, rather than actually using the monitoring data in any way. This is not uncommon. And I think one of the hardest parts we run into, it's easy with IoT devices, right? We have a clear data set. They bring it in. Easy is relative. But we have a clear data set that we can pull in, understandings of how they're operating, understandings of what they're seeing from whatever their purpose is. And you may have 5 to 50 parameters coming off of a device. It's really hard with inspections. Everybody knows Big Bertha. They kick Big Bertha 5 times a year, make sure the transformers were running all right. They have a few things they do every time, but they may only log a third of it. So understanding and being able to talk to your user groups, if it's something that includes field crews, if it's something that includes more than just 1 or 2 people and just an algorithm that's going to be automated, you have to know what they actually want and find a way to engage them, which may actually end up with an additional component to an application. Maybe it's a dashboard, maybe it's a view of their performance, maybe it's just a star at the end of the day saying you were safe today. But understanding what those users want, not just what the SME wants, will help with adoption and make these more successful. And then lastly, figuring out a way to not burden that kind of internal core group with too much maintenance. So this can come in a lot of different directions. There are a lot of different structures that utilities have built. Some have put this group within their IT teams. Some have had decentralized teams with just a couple of people kind of in a central way organizing what technology they provide, and then having SMEs that are digital hires within individual business units. Some have brought their own teams and put them in the corporate organization, had them be essentially a service organization. They're earning revenue and then transferring ownership of that application back to a business unit. Can create some interesting business models at times in that respect. So finding that way to make sure IT is able to maintain and be able to get it over to the business units they can use is important. So with that, I wanted to take a quick second for a poll, because I'm actually really curious about this. You know, we had 40% say they're already kind of in production, but for your organization, what is the biggest barrier that you run into from a digital transformation side of things? So I can tell you on my end, we're going through a similar process inside Wood Mackenzie. And one of the things I find very interesting is I'm raring to go to get involved, but the team's only so big. So I know the staffing side is something that I always run into. And that's really, okay, so we're starting to get a little diversity. And I'm not actually that surprised. The relationship building side of things is, okay, we're getting a little movement there. The relationship building side of things for a lot of these cross-functional projects tend to be very hard, and making sure you have people that know how to work together and are the folks in the organization that get things through is particularly difficult. So it's one of the reasons I wanted to call out that kind of at least executive level, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the folks underneath and how that can work. Also digital team resources. Cool. So I'm going to go through kind of those 6 points in a little bit more detail, starting out with the team. One of the most interesting conversations I've had in the last 3 years involving analytics, I was talking to the head of analytics for an IOU in the Southeast. And one of the most important things he said is, I can't hire 5, 10 data analysts, and I don't want to. I can go to the business units, find folks that show talent, and offer them something that's different, something that's not going to get bogged down, something that gets them off of Tableau and into something interesting that will advance their career. And it's not rocket science. We do this with a lot of folks. We send, organizations send people to funded MBA frequently, but a funded data science certificate, a funded data engineer, master's, potentially a PhD if you see a lot of opportunity there that's done in concert with work, is a great way to maintain a potentially frustrated, talented individual and allow them to grow within the organization, and for that matter, bring those relationships along with him that he's built with the business units he's worked with, or she's worked with. On the external side, it's not something where you would discount them completely. It is still very worthwhile to have, obviously, some senior folks that have training that are able to kind of move things along, but you don't have to stack the group with people from an external perspective, because they're going to have a tougher time in contextual discussions, a more difficult time being able to relate to what an end user is actually asking for versus an internal employee. So there's a mix there that you have to think about. And I think one of the most interesting things I've run into in the past year is really this focus on it. The data team is not just a data scientist. You need somebody that knows how to move information, not just model things. Modeling things is important, but they need support. You need folks that can help with the enterprise architecture to make sure that they're not wasting time every single time re-architecting all of the data flows. You need people that can work on UX and people that can actually do design to be able to make something functional for a user group if you're trying to roll this out to a large team. And then obviously you need support from those business units. So presumably through that use case definition, you at least have a view of what the management team within that group wants. And you could even try and expand that and try and get a larger list if it's helpful. But you have some idea of what they're looking for, so you want to find the use cases that they're going to engage with you on. Talking about, I know this is a little bit complicated, we're going to walk through it. Talking about how to actually acquire a use case capability, obviously first things first, you have to prioritize what you're looking for. So when you look at a priority perspective, first and foremost is value. Value can mean a lot of things. Obviously, profitability is the first one people think of. Cost reduction, increased revenues, new products, those are all things that are great and important. But that might not be the main driver you have. It may be value of risk aversion by trying to improve safety standards in some way. It could be something that maybe it doesn't even involve the distribution grid or your customer. Maybe it just involves your HR practices to ensure people are well rested and not working for 12 months straight with doubles half the time. So there's a lot of different factors you can bring into that discussion, but it's something you have to kind of figure out as you go. Typically what we've seen from utilities when they start this process, when they have a small 2, 3, 4-man team, is they start with something that's fairly easy, they know is going to bring in some type of value, to be able to show some capabilities and start getting the team used to a process and get SMEs familiar with it. Revenue assurance is a very common one because most utilities think there's some way that they can do a better job of enforcing collections, figuring out where there is theft, if it's something where they're not even noticing it, and figuring out ways to deal with that. From a acquisition perspective, there's 3 paths you can go. The whole point of having this internal organization is not to develop everything in-house. It's to have that ability to, 1, evaluate what a vendor is providing you as an option. 2, if you need something custom, you have some ability to develop that custom capability. And 3, you have people to work with that can, on a vendor side, that can actually talk to the people that are developing your kind of customized solution if you go on the vendor route. So there's a bunch of different drivers you can run into that may push you in one direction or another. From a high level, going with a vendor, you typically want to choose something that it is going to take you an extensive amount of time to develop, the market's mature on. There may be a lot of players or somebody who's just clearly, at the moment, well ahead. And it's going to take you a lot of resources to develop. From a partnering perspective, and this is very common, I'd say there's a lot of examples from SDG&E doing IP shares with vendors to Exelon and GE developing storm prediction algorithms that they can then sell to other GE customers. It's something where there's usually some type of IP sharing to be able to figure out a way to generate a little bit more value for the utility, but it might be something that doesn't exist today and you want to develop it in a partnership perspective. Or it might be something you just need from a custom perspective. It might be sensitive information. It might be something that you just don't see in the market or vendors don't see enough of a market for that they're just not willing to partner. From a database perspective, I'm not going to go into every technology. It's not the point of this discussion. The point is to think about how we orient our databases. And really, 3 areas I personally think are particularly important. Understanding the customer, which is often one of the first areas people go. 1, because AMI data is already in a database that's less than 10 years old, and there's a lot of it. CIS data is annoying, but can be helpful in that respect. And presumably there's additional value you can understand that you can get out of understanding your customer better and start getting a bit more of a profile around them, be it from pulling in census data about where they live, maybe zip code level, maybe individual premise level. It may be understanding better what their behaviors are from a load profile perspective and just doing better segmentation. It could be a lot of things, but being able to have that kind of 360 view of the customer that pulls multiple systems into one place is important. From an asset perspective, you're talking about EAM and ERP data to understand when you bought that asset, who's it from, what are the quirks with it, what type of work tickets have you gotten in as you've visited that asset and inspected it, as well as if you have any monitoring equipment, being able to get that information into one place so it's more easy to pull into some type of asset health algorithms that you may build in-house or go out-of-house for. And then systems, and I think this is the hardest one. I actually was having a conversation 2 hours ago about this, because I don't think we've quite figured it out as an industry, any type of time-efficient way to do this. But there is an idea right now that people are trying to focus on understanding how we can design our systems in a way that we can pull a view from the GIS and combine that with our planning models, with our transmission models, et cetera. There's so much history there that it is a massive undertaking right now. But the promise is there of trying to pull all of that into one place so it's easier to get at, so you can build applications off it and be a little bit more nimble when your regulator comes to you and says, hey, we really need to improve our distribution planning because you keep telling me interconnections are going to slow down another few months. That's something I won't accept. I need that to move forward. And there's not trying to get too deep into that, but between non-wires alternatives, interconnections of resources, and the ability to point to where you want resources, those are areas that have been very difficult for utilities to get settled within 2, 3, 4 years even in some cases, because the data, the systems don't talk all that well together from a planning perspective. And then I've just added some other public data samples. Obviously, a project may call for a variety of public data samples. I think the most interesting thing I ran into talking to utilities, I'm talking to an electric and gas utility. Actually, I think they're pretty public about it. So I was talking to Con Ed. I live in New York City. Particularly interesting when you start talking about safety and gas in a city that you live in. What they found was a tremendous correlation between stoops, which there are a lot of in Brooklyn brownstones, in the Upper West and Upper East Side brownstones. Those 8 to 10 stair stoops were where they were running into freezing of gas lines. And a lot of their issues with gas leaks were coming from those stoops. So one of their focuses was to pull in their information from their network model for their gas and be able to find another vendor that could give them information. In this case, I believe it was satellite pictures, to be able to identify all of the stoops within the area, within their territory, and be able to find a better way to inspect those stoops. So the applications can get a little outside of what we would normally talk about in a grid edge perspective, but can be a lot of value of pulling those pieces together. And lastly, from a handoff perspective, I just wanted to reiterate, 100% you have to involve users in this if it's something that's going to be an application used by a sizable group. You don't want to design something and have adoption be 5%. You don't want people to continue not entering ticket information because it's annoying. So you have to figure out what are the ways that you can incentivize those employees to buy into the system, to see value over the next 6 months, 8 months, year, 2 years, because it's not easy to motivate people. It's not easy to get people to change. And then from a handoff perspective, we already talked about this a little bit, but handing off the application to the business unit, a lot of times that'll involve an asset switch or ownership switch, and also handing off the software component to the IT team to really manage. So with that, I just wanted to close out with another poll, which goes a little bit deeper than what we had from Julian's poll earlier. But just from a organizational perspective, kind of where are you all? Just looking in kind of within that 6-step framework. It's not particularly surprised here. It's encouraging to see folks are kind of recognizing some value in there. It's something that isn't always the case as we see these types of efforts, because they can be pretty large endeavors across the industry, with some utilities even committing well over $100 million to building out these capabilities over 5-10 years. So very interesting to see. So it seems like we're coming along in this respect. And yeah, with that, I will turn it over for the next panel. Thank you.